Okay. Well, hello, and thank you all for joining us today in the debate titled Global Strategy and Geopolitical Dynamics in Latin America, organized by the Global Strategy Interest Group of the Strategic Management Society. My name is Maria Andrea de Villa. I will be the moderator of the debate, and the experts engaging in the debate are William Newberry, who is writer eminent scholar of global business at Florida International University, Gerald McDermott, who is department chair and professor of international business at University of South Carolina, Luciano Chivarenga, who is full professor at INCAE Business School, and Santiago Mingo, who is associate professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. So the motion driving this fantastic debate is the following. In Latin America, to align with a global power will be a threat to global South trade routes, welfare, prosperity, and peace. The team debating for the motion will argue that, yes, aligning with a global power would threaten global South trade routes, welfare, prosperity, and peace. The experts on this team are Gerald McDermott and Santiago Mingo, and the team debating against the motion will argue that no, aligning with a global power is necessary. The experts on this team are William Newberry and Luciano Chivarenga. The debate will follow a modified Oxbridge-style format, which means that we will first have an opening round in which the experts will follow the order indicated in this table, and they will have each 5 minutes to speak. Then we will have a crossfire round in which each expert can respond to the opposing team in 4 minutes. And then we will be following this by questions from the audience to the experts to open the debate to all of you. And then the last round will focus on closing arguments by each of the experts in 3 minutes. I will be keeping the time for each speaker to make sure that they do not exceed the assigned time slots in each round. And before 30 seconds to the end of that time, I will just interrupt and say 30 seconds so they are aware that their time will be ending soon. Before we start, we want to ask the audience to please vote either for the motion side or against the motion side so that we can see where you are standing before the debate starts. And then at the end of the debate, we will ask again the audience to vote either for the motion or against the motion side to see which side gets the highest number of votes. Now, let's start by asking the audience to please vote for or against the motion by using their mobiles to scan this QR code that is appearing in the screen. Or you can also go into the website slido.com, and when you are asked the name of the event, you can type SMS. So you can use your mobiles or to scan the code, or you can go into slido.com, and just say SMS, and this will allow you to vote. So let's see what are the views of the audience. Okay. Okay, interestingly, it's changing. Please vote. It's nice to see before the debate. What are your views? Okay, so this vote will remain open for some minutes as we start the debate. So if any of you want to continue voting, you can. And then before voting again, we will again look at this result. By now, we can see 61% against the motion and 39% for the motion. Okay. So now let's start the debate with the opening round. I give now the floor to Gerald.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Jerry McDermott. I'm the chair of the Sunoco International Business Department, and it looks like Santiago and I have an uphill climb since it's almost 2-1 against us. And we'd like to open up with a couple of points. The way we look at this question and why we're for it. And it's a little bit, misleading how the question is phrased, but essentially, is it necessary for Latin American countries to align themselves with great powers in order to have prosperity and growth? And it's not necessary, but we're for we're for the statement, and our point is about developing your own growth engines. And let's look at it this way. First point, historically, over the last 100 years, Latin America really has gotten no benefits by aligning itself with any great power. It gets a few nickels and dimes, and the costs have been tremendous. As Porfirio Diaz said 100 years ago, poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. And that really sums it up for the last 100 years for Latin America. Because if anything, aligning yourself with a great power gets you a few benefits in the short run and usually exploitation. And indeed, that strange organization called the McKinsey Institute put out a huge report looking at 20 years of NAFTA's impact on the Mexican economy. And it said Mexico had a whopping 0% growth in productivity after 20 years of NAFTA. So it's not necessary. What we're trying to say, first of all, is that aligning yourself doesn't necessarily get you any great benefits. The second key point is, let's tilt to where in the last 60 years we've seen countries break out of the middle income trap. And there are very few, like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. And those are basically non-aligned, right? And they have built up, in fact, that's a message for what has been going on for years in these debates about growth and trade, about the importance of building the developmental state. And we could see lots of good examples. In fact, I bring to you Arturo Frondizi. If we could think about Arturo Frondizi of Argentina, one of the great presidents, and also people like Getulio Vargas, they should be inspirations for us in charting a way forward of peace and prosperity. The last thing is think about Peter Katzenstein, one of the great thinkers of the modern age, and he wrote this seminal book called Small States and World Markets. And indeed, in looking at that on Europe, we can apply that to small states in Latin America. They have the ability, if you look at Chile, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Panama, they are charting their own paths forward. It doesn't mean you don't have to, and all those paths forward are based on export-led growth models and collaboration with their neighbors. Lastly, that's the big thing. Untapped resources in Latin America. Latin America has everything that the world wants, and it can be a leader in the global south. It has great HR, it has incredible natural resources, and it really has not tapped into its own regional trade and investment collaboration. It keeps looking abroad, looking far away for the answers, when the answers are among its neighbors. So if there is a level of alliances and collaboration, it will come out of its own systems, out of its own South American organizations like UNASUR and Mercosur, right? And Mexico could be a leader with Central American countries as well. And that's what I would say is our opening framework. You don't get a lot from aligning yourself to a great power, and history shows you get a lot more if you develop your own developmental state and an export-led growth policy and collaborating with your neighbors.
Thank you, Gerald. Okay. So now let's go to our next speaker, which is William Newbury.
Okay, thank you for inviting me to be on this, very interesting debate. I was assigned to the against the motion, and I have a master's degree in international affairs, but that was just a few years ago. So I needed to do a little updating myself. So I did a little search. Non-alignment is very fashionable right now. I came across a book, an edited book with all kinds of scholars in 2023 talking about non-alignment, all kinds of editorials regarding why Latin America should non-align or pursue non-alignment. So I found a lot of arguments. I'm not going to tell Jerry and Santiago, but but the other thing is these books and these sources, they had all the counter arguments too. And so these are my thoughts, but they're also building on things I found in these other books. And so the first thing I would like to say is, alignment is multidimensional. It's political, it's military, it's economic, it's environmental policy, it's cultural. There's a lot going on in the word alignment, right? And as business scholars, we tend to think about the economic part, but we have to consider the whole thing, right? And so the one thing I found out in these books, in the arguments, is that it's very popular to say non-alignment. Let's go for it. Let's try to do it. Achievement's another story. And so I only have a few minutes, so I'm just going to make some points. First point against achievement: there's limited cohesion in Latin America. As one author said, at this writing, regional cooperation appears to be a pipe dream. Having some Latin American policy on non-alignment, getting people to agree on it, is going to be very, very tricky in the current political situation of Latin America, where people are countries are all over the place in their political systems and so on. Second point is location. Latin America is in the Americas physically, and because there's political science theories like Geopolitical that says, countries have to make decisions giving their circumstances and factors. And an important factor here is the location of Latin America. It is very close to one superpower. It's very far from another one, right? We also know from scholars Rugman and Verbeke that most trade is regional. And even in their updated article in 2020, Rosa, Googler, and Verbeke, still 74% of trade by the global 500 is regional, and Latin America is in the Americas region. Third thing I'll point out is there's a lot of cultural interdependence. I'm sorry. Right now, 18.99% of the U.S. population is Hispanic or Latino. This is 71% of the overall growth of the U.S. population between 2022 and 2023. We have a Hispanic Secretary of State. We have super, super strong Latin cultural connections. We see this in all kinds of entertainment, probably, music being probably the most dominant one. Bad Bunny, Shakira, Gloria Estefan, Luis Miguel. And this, we talk about soft power in international relations and international business, and the soft power connections between Latin America and the United States are super strong. And growing. And so these, Latin America is aligned to the United States, and the alignment's just growing by nature, right? And no offense to China, I've been to China many times, but there's the connection is very different there, right? And so, and that I guess will lead me to my last point, which I'll go very quickly on because I see I'm running out of time. It would be hard to pursue a symmetrical non-alignment approach to the two superpowers. The way they operate in the region is very different. The way they pursue investments in the region is very different. The ties to the region is very different. And I think I'm going to stop there because I don't have enough time to go into a lot more depth. But overall, I just think while it's a nice idea to say non-alignment's a great thing to pursue, in reality, it's a hard one to achieve.
Okay, thank you. Now let's give the word to Santiago.
Okay, thank you, Maria Andrea. So after Jerry opening, he's reminding us that Latin America has rarely benefited from aligning too closely to any global power, and especially the US. So I want to go deeper into this East Asia model, okay, in particular Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and also Southeast Asia in general with their ASEAN organization. So let me tell you a bit about the story of Chile. We can give some light about this issue. Chile was called in the 90s and early thousands the Latin American tiger, okay, relating the country to these Asian tigers, okay. GDP growth went up drastically, 5.8% on average during that period. GDP per capita, it triples in 2 decades, and poverty rate fell from almost 39% to 14%. Okay, so my point is that Chile can be a model, okay, to other Latin American countries, and this I want to connect it to this approach of making something where the countries within the region put themselves together, take advantage of their own situations, and start creating a model of development that is unique to Latin America, okay, but also takes some elements of this East Asian model that I was talking about. So trade openness, okay, as a development engine, not a political concession, pursuing diversified free trade agreements instead of deep alignment with any great power, okay, investing in institutional credibility, treating geopolitical tensions as strategic space to maneuver, okay? So China and the US will be fighting and continue fighting with this very difficult trade war, and Latin America can take advantage of that and start working together, take advantage of their connections to the global south, and while these other countries fight, we can take opportunity of that, okay, and think strategically, start cooperating. We know that Latin America does not have a lot of trade among ourselves, okay? So it's time to do something about that. We also have huge natural resources, and that is a key point because these countries like the US and China will still need us, whether we align them with them or not, okay? They need our natural resources, they need our minerals, they need our mining, our agriculture, our water. Okay, so we have all those things, and we should take advantage of that. So we don't need really to align with any of these other two countries. One thing that I want to point out that is crucial that as we start developing our own path and our own networks, we should combine that with building new innovation systems within our countries and start exporting not only natural resources, but also value-added products and services, and especially looking at the global south. So in general, we can build this strong future for the region, taking advantage of this trade war. Finally, as a closing point, we also have opportunity to cooperate in terms of developing infrastructure. Okay, that's a big issue. We are a very large region, And one way to connect with each other is to cooperate in building infrastructure, connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific. Okay, we are right there in that position, a perfect position to do that now that the US is making that very difficult. So those are my main points, and I will come back to this at the end of the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Santiago. I now give the floor to Luciano.
Thank you very much. So picking up on where the debate is, I am in favor of Latin America aligning not with any power. Latin America should align with the US. That's my very clear position. And the reason for my argument go back to history. So this idea of non-alignment was actually developed. One of the first places where economic non-alignment as an idea came up was precisely in Latin America. Okay, so the political non-alignment, you think of India, for example, the ideas came up in other places, but the economic non-alignment, I refer to the thinking of Raúl Prebisch, Argentinian economist in the 1940s and 1950s, and the establishment of CEPAL, or ECLAC, Economic Commission for Latin America, which still exists, okay? Now, so this idea of trying to move from exporting commodities, exporting natural resources to the world, and working under a system of imperial free trade, sort of, first it was Pax Britannica, then Pax Americana. So we have a power protecting freedom of navigation, freedom of trade. We take advantage of it, export our goods, and get rich. So these guys, Raúl Prebisch, and later the dependentistas like Cardoso and Faletto and others more radical like Frank, argued we should do the opposite. We should close our economies and tax export and subsidize industry, and that way we're going to develop technology, we're going to move away from commodities, we're going to become competitive. That experiment was tried between 1950 and 1980 everywhere in Latin America, and it failed. There is no country that has become competitive at any manufacturing. Latin America is not competitive at manufacturing. Most protective industries have never managed to become competitive. Brazil still subsidizes and protects car production today, and is still not competitive. Whereas the counterexample is precisely NAFTA. Some of the most productive, actually the most productive automotive plants, and I'm speaking as a consultant in the automotive industry here, are precisely in Mexico, because of NAFTA. Now everything is changing, so I don't want to touch upon what is happening right now. But within a free trade agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada, Mexico had some of the most competitive and productive automotive plants in the world, better including than the plants in Japan. The opposite is Brazil. Protected industries, 40 years of subsidies at the cost of consumers and taxes, money which could have been spent in schools or hospitals or roads, and car production in Brazil is still not competitive, and there isn't one single Brazilian brand. So to me, the historical example is clear. Non-aligning with a global power in terms of economics has caused indebtedness and has failed in terms of innovation and technology. Moreover, do we want to look at the countries that today have the highest GDP per capita and the best life expectancy? You find precisely countries that have very much aligned with the US. You find Costa Rica, you find Chile, you find Dominican Republic, and then you find countries that have developed in a time when they were also open, Argentina and Uruguay. Because we have to be very careful here. Argentina and Uruguay became very wealthy when they had an open economy and they aligned with Britain at the time. Then they closed up and basically they stalled and they started to fall backward. So my point is simply based on a historical example, economic history, and a counterfactual that we can actually empirically test. In the words of Fernando Enrique Cardoso, who was one of the intellectuals for dependentismo, he himself argued that that ideology in terms of economic has failed, and hence we should open our economies. However, I want to close by saying I agree with Santiago in a sense that opening the economy doesn't mean exporting only commodities. I mean, you can move from fruit to wine and processed juice, which is something that both Chile and Brazil have done, and etc. Let's close here because I think I don't want to take too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Luciano. Okay, well, we're closing this first round with very nice pitches from all of the experts, but still quite polite, referencing each other, but we want to see more crossfire between all of you. So what about, the comments of the US regarding the Panama Channel? What about the US tariffs? What about the implications of the US trade war? But there are different implications if you're a small country in Latin America versus a medium-sized or large country. Okay, now hopefully we're going to see more crossfire responding to each other's comments. And I call Santiago to start the fire.
Okay, so it's 4 minutes now, right?
Yes, 4 minutes.
Yes. Okay, let's go. So first, I'm very surprised that neither Luciano or Bills mentioned the word Donald Trump. That's the first thing that I was very, very surprised. And the second thing was that they didn't even say a word about China. Okay, so I mean, we have the US, right? We can align with the US, but you never said anything about China. And in fact, China has been investing aggressively in Latin America. I would have expected to see some comments about how aligning with the US, which is their main point, how would that affect our relationship with China, right? I didn't see any points about that. So that's what I'm very concerned about that in particular. So now let me move to other issues. So Luciano was mentioning that we have failed in the past about creating a strong network among Latin American countries. But I don't know how alignment will help to resolve that problem. Okay, so that's something that I'm not sure about. So this historical point to argue that we are never going to be able to create a strong network of trade among ourselves within Latin America, and also a strong network of trade with other countries without aligning with the US. I was surprised about that. So it's not entirely true that most trade is regional within Latin America. Okay, I think I heard that somewhere. I think Bill mentioned it. And there's a variety of cultures and differences between Latin American countries that was mentioned as something against, in favor of aligning with other countries. Okay, but I also don't know. It depends on your point of comparison, right? Remember that we all speak Spanish. Okay, we all have connections, colonial connections with Spain. There are a lot of investment of Spanish companies in Latin America. So I don't know how you can say that cultural ties are not there. Okay, I kind of agree that geographically, okay, the situation of the region is very diverse, but that doesn't mean that we cannot get together, okay, and build something interesting as we watch this trade war. Okay, who can guarantee that if we aligned with the US, okay, Donald Trump will probably have any kind of policies or new tariffs or anything that will affect us negatively, and he doesn't really care if we are on his side or not. And especially because of this trade war, we may have a lot of trouble creating a path forward as a unique region that can be a leader in the global south. I will stop here.
Perfect, Santiago. Thank you. So now I give the word to Luciano to fight back.
All right, let me try to raise the tension a little bit. Fair enough. We didn't mention the current president of the US, partly because I don't want to be denied entry to the US. I am 100% honest here. However, let's answer to Santiago. I think at this point it's important to go back to something that Bill mentioned. We need to take into account that Latin America, partly because of the way it is shaped, and it's something you can read in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, it has, it's diverse. So if we talk about Mesoamerica, from Mexico down to Panama, and possibly it could include Colombia and Venezuela, I would definitely strengthen my argument in terms of geography. Any economist would tell you gravitational models of trade with much globalization we have show that geographic proximity for manufacturing trade is still very much important. So I think the argument would hold. However, if you talk about South America, then I kind of agree with Santiago, because in countries like Chile and Peru, China is already by far the biggest investor and trading partner. And geographically, because of the Pacific, it does make more sense to trade with China than to trade with the US, or at least it makes as much sense. So that's for South America. It's for the Pacific part of South America, meaning Peru, Chile, and Ecuador that have a coast, possibly Bolivia. I think that is an interesting question. All right. Then now, in terms of aligning or not aligning, again, I think we need to go back to history, in a sense that non-US powers, which used to be the Soviet Union and today the global competitor is China, didn't have that much influence historically in Latin America. Even phenomena which could have looked as explicitly anti-American, like the Cuban and Sandinista revolutions, were very much an endogenous, a local affair, okay? And then if you look at later developments, for example, if you look at why the Sandinistas are still in power in Nicaragua, they received a lot of support, but from Venezuela, not from China. It's very much, and during the civil war in El Salvador, the Cubans helped the guerrilla, and et cetera, meaning that even during the Cold War, much of the opposition was not between, the Soviet Union was not as much involved in Latin America. Okay, that's my point. So China, even less so. China is very much involved in terms of investment, and mostly in terms of exports and imports. It imports commodities from Latin America, and it exports manufacturing. So my point is that there's not a precedent of another global power except the two powers that have been granting a pax, an imperial sort of pax to the world, which is first Britain and then the US. Those two countries have intervened in Latin America. The other global powers don't have a history of doing so. And if you look at how China is managing its foreign policy, where it is really investing, where it is setting up bases, it's mostly regional. And it makes sense here I connect with Trump and with Putin and what is happening now. We are moving away from a globalist approach to an approach whereby the big military, strategic, and economic powers of the world are focusing on their surrounding. What has Donald Trump spoken about? He has spoken about Greenland and about Panama, and they are very much within the Americas. He doesn't seem to be that interested in Ukraine, for example, which is far away. And China is very much focusing on Taiwan and its neighbors, okay? So yes, China is the biggest buyer of Brazilian soy, for example. But at the same time, if you look at the total of Chinese imports, China imports and exports a lot more to Asian countries than to Latin America. But I mean, by a far percentage, it's like 70% of
20
it,
seconds.
roughly, I think. So that's it. So
Sorry, Luciano. Thank you. Okay, now we want to hear from Gerald.
All right, thank you. So I'd just like to address a couple of these points. The first basic, if you've been listening to my respected colleagues on the other side, their basic argument is that the locals cannot do it themselves and they need someone else to guide them in life. And I think that is both a bit naive, if not insulting, to Latin America. They are a diverse group of people, just like the Europeans. Luciano, you are from, I believe, a European country. And after 2 world wars, almost 3 on your continent in 80 years, you figured out how to work together. So the first thing is alignment. Just to be clear, alignment. We're getting dominated by this word. Alignment can or cannot happen, but not having alignment, doesn't mean you can't grow. So the basic point here that we're trying to say is that any of these countries can build up their capacities for export-led growth, for innovation, and really become much more strategic with their way they're developing trade and investment relationships. And they don't need to be beholden to a superpower to do that. And in fact, that's what the East Asian model shows us. And then that's what I'm saying is that you bring up people like Raul Prebisch. Prebisch was one of the great fathers of developing local capabilities and actually export-led growth. He wasn't just sort of saying to close up the economy. And that's why I brought up our dear friend Arturo Frondizi, friend of my in-laws, because that's what his path was. In fact, he maintained great relationships with the Kennedys and with Asian leaders. And that's what part of his innovation was, to open up multiple relationships for the prosperity of his country. So the idea that they can't do it on their own is a false pretense, and they can. And the biggest thing, too, to remember, I think what Santiago was saying, is the amount of and the quality of resources that these countries have is tremendous. In a sense, they have much greater bargaining position than they're given credit for. And that's when they can cut deals, first of all, with one another. They can bootstrap one another. And again, the European project in the post-war period was evidence of being able to do that. And they can work together on those things, but also allow any great power. That doesn't mean you're not cutting a deal with the EU or the US or China. But the point is that you don't need to align, again, with any one particular group, right? If you're a skilled negotiator. And there are great times when they've shown that. The last thing we want to understand, too, is that we are not saying that being independent means you're closing up your economy. That's not what is happening. In fact, what we're saying is that there's good evidence that these countries can be more independent and open up their economy in their own way, and also develop projects of cooperation, particularly infrastructure, in multiple forms. And that's what leader. And I even think that Mexico might be a leader on this. They will be the pivotal actor to really show that they can be independent and to bring in investment. That's what they're doing right now from all over the world. And I'll leave it at that because my time's up.
Thank you, Gerald. So now let's hear from Bill. Bill, you're muted.
Bill, you have to turn on your mic.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So very interesting conversation. Very good points by our counterparts, and particularly by my Luciano, my team member. Some replies. So the first thing I don't totally buy these East Asian comparisons. In the 1980s, the 1970s, even the 90s, when South Korea was growing, China wasn't yet the dominant superpower it is now. It had opened up in 78, so it was opening up to the world, but I don't think the conditions that, you know, South Korea advance are the same as the conditions in Latin America in terms of, you know, the dominant superpower. So I don't know that the comparisons are exactly the same. So that's the first thing. Second thing, you know, the point about needing infrastructure was brought. And Latin America would benefit from infrastructure, greater infrastructure across the country, or across the countries in the continent. However, saying they need it and actually achieving it and getting the cooperation to do this, I think is a different thing, right? And so you know, Latin America, you know, I would love that they had, you know, we still have a case where people go to conference for the AIB Latin America chapter, they fly through Miami to get their connecting flights because they can't always get connecting flights between cities in Latin America, right? And so it's getting better, but you know, but the progress has been, you know, has been slow, and I think this is an issue to keep in mind. The third point I want to bring up is, you know, the one I started at the end of my presentation last time, is the symmetry one. You know, China has been doing a lot of investment in Latin America. You know, it's the second largest investor in Latin America. I think in Brazil, it's the #1 trading partner. But overall, so there's a lot of growth in Chinese investment. Chinese investment, from what I can see, and I can be corrected, is its primary economic. So it's just one part of the overall alignment picture, right? You know, the cultural alignment is not there. You know, the political alignment is not there. You know, and so this, you know, is it really an alignment with China to do this? And this is something we can debate. What does it mean to be alignment, to be aligned, right? So I think, you know, we need to keep in mind that when the U.S. invests, you know, Latin America does have some influence in the U.S. too. You know, Latin America, like I say, where they're 19% of the U.S. population, they have, you know, starting to have very strong people in the U.S. government, including Trump's Secretary of State. And so this is more of, you know, Jerry said, you know, Latin America does have power, and I totally agree with them. And this is part of being aligned, is part of not just being, you know, the source of resources for another country. It's actually being able to work with, you know, have some kind of influence going the other way with the other country. And I think, you know, Latin America, but in particularly the Central America, as Luciano talked about, has that ability with the United States, and a growing ability just because of the population switch. And I'm trying to think, I think that's where I'll end for right now, because my time's almost up.
Thank you, Bill. All right, so now we want to open the discussion to the audience. There have been some points, some questions in the chat, but we would like questions specifically. So please go ahead and post questions for them. I would like to start with the first question. How does alignment happen when one side threatens with sanctions? What can we say about that?
Maybe the no camp should start with that one. I'll leave that to Bill and Luciano.
Want to go for it, Luciano, or do you want?
Sorry, is that question for us or for the audience?
For you, from the audience.
Okay. Okay, how does alignment work where there is a threat of sanctions? Well,
From
that's
one
part
side.
of, yes. Well, that is precisely when it works. You show that you align, you don't get sanctions. And here again, I think I want to kind of repeat my point, but answer to something that was brought up before and I didn't touch upon it, which is the example of the Panama Canal. Well, simply put, although some of the information circulated about the building of the Panama Canal is preposterous because the majority of the 20 or 30,000 people who died were not American citizens. In fact, that was a very, very tiny percentage of it. However, the money and the engineering to make the Panama Canal did come from the US. So Panama as a country finds itself with something like oil, which produces an enormous amount of money, and that was built without using taxpayers' money or any other source of local money. So that was a gift from the US. This is an actual reality. The second point is that who uses the Panama Canal? 60% of the use of the Panama Canal is US trade between West and East Coast. I mean, the majority is US trade and a very high percentage is on US boat. Third point, from a strategic and military perspective, who has use of the Panama Canal? The US. So, you know, the point is you have something whose major customer is a global power. I mean, aligning with anybody else who doesn't really use what you have doesn't make much sense. This is a simple fact. It's a bit like saying, you know, this is why I understand Santiago's point that he says, well, you know, in a country like Peru, where the majority of export goes to China, there is the Pacific, China is building a very large port. Why should Peru align with the US? That's also a valid question. But in case of Central America, the Caribbean, and in the case of Panama, I just think it makes sense because of geography and because of who uses the infrastructure. Okay, so that's my answer. And the fact of sanctions, well, this is the threat of sanctions now is it's unfortunately a fact of life, and it doesn't apply just to Latin America. We are all in the same game, and I don't have a very precise answer because this is also a very new thing. I mean, it's changing every day. We have not studied this yet.
Okay.
Can I go back to your question, Maria Andrea?
Yes, please.
So this alignment, right? We have to remember that we are choosing between China and the US, and those countries are fighting with each other, and we are not aligning with countries that are not fighting with each other. Okay, so that's a very important point, and especially the US right now, it's a very it's a country that has a lot of variability in all the policies that are being implemented by Donald Trump. So one thing is aligning with a politically stable country in terms of the policies that they are taking, and another thing is aligning with the with a country in that current situation. Okay, so we need to differentiate when we are aligning and to whom we are aligning and what's happening between those countries that are thinking about aligning. It's very different to align with a country in a time of peace, right? Which is not what is going on right now.
Can I just pick up on this point because I've seen some comments related to it? Is remember the charge in the vote is like it's almost like it says to align with a global power would be a threat to global South. Trade routes, welfare, and prosperity and peace. And that's what we agree with. But understand this. So first of all, people, besides Mexico and some CAFTA countries, and that's only been in, you know, since the mid-90s, Latin America doesn't have a lot of trade and investment ties with the United States. Okay, first of all, let alone a lot of any other region. I mean, you know, they probably South America, you know, has an agreement now, a trade accord, for instance, with the EU or Mercosur does. But the point is that they've never really needed or benefited greatly from aligning themselves to a great power. So that has to be proven first. And you can't use NAFTA because, again, NAFTA, you know, Mexico hasn't really had much growth over the last 30 years. And just because they're trading a lot to the United States and get a lot of or good amount of FDI doesn't mean they're necessarily benefiting. And we could see the social and economic problems that are coming out of Mexico. So their model is broken. So there's no, you know, just put that aside. The second thing about alignment or growth and prosperity is there's no reason to think, and in fact, there's good historical reason for seeing that any of these countries can develop their own growth models on their own and with one another, that doesn't need necessarily a strong alignment with any great power, right? And in fact, the third thing, because this was about the global South as well, is that who's going to lead the global South, right? If anybody, you know, Latin American countries are there to rise up and lead the global South, right? And you could imagine that the large countries and mid-sized countries could be developing much greater prosperous routes across the global South than going south to north. South to north is the old game. The future of the world, 85% of the consumers' resources, land, are in the global South, right? And so that is a call for Latin American countries to lead that. That's where they want to be in the future. Now, you could say, hey, Brazil, you're 170 million people, you're a behemoth. It's time to get a little bit more responsible for regional leadership, right? And we would love to see, and that's what it's going to take. But because Brazil may be slow on that, doesn't mean you cede all rights and power to the United States, the EU, or to China for that matter.
Okay, thank you. There's another comment regarding opening further the discussion about relations between Latin American countries and others, like Europe, US, China. So it would be good if we could extend the discussion on geopolitical tensions more within the region and conflicts among the governments, left wing versus right wing, and how some governments are desiring to become regional leaders. What do you have to say about that?
Santiago, you want to go first?
Yes, yeah, I can go first. So the thing is that that question is I mean, that comment, it's very important because we know that we have a lot of political differences between Latin American countries. Some countries are very left-wing countries, other countries are very right-wing countries. Okay, so the thing is that we should try to get together and improve our own relationships. Okay, and I don't know how aligning with either China or the US will help with that, because what will happen is that some Latin American countries may align with China, other Latin American countries will align with the US. So at the end of the day, aligning will increase those geopolitical tensions instead of decreasing it. Because here we're not talking about aligning the whole region, the whole Latin American region with either power. We are talking about that we will see a fragmentation. I mean, this potential alignment will lead to more fragmentation instead of less fragmentation.
Right. Let me pick up on something Santiago was saying there. The issue really isn't left or right. I mean, if you have good polities and good regions, you're always going to have left and right, right? So that's not an issue. And all these countries of left and right go switch back and forth. I think the first thing that to think about too is who are the real dynamic growers and countries in all of Latin America. And the first that come to mind that the Economist magazine would rate is Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile. And, you know, ideologically, they are very different, right? Some have a much more social democratic focus. Some have more of a sort of, you know, right democratic, you know, Christian democratic. And that leads me to my second point. The key thing here is making sure that one another are promoting democratic governance. That is the key thing, not falling into authoritarian governance. Now, you have some of that in Latin America, like in a lot of parts of the world. But if the core is thinking about democratic governance, more or less, you can prosper. And in fact, I was a little bit concerned that Bill Newberry, who did all this research, actually didn't pick up our book from 10 years ago from Laszlo Bruce and myself on this very issue. And in it, we build part of it on our great friend John Peverhouse at University of Chicago, who actually showed how, for instance, even as weak as Mercosur was absolutely critical in maintaining democratic values in key moments among member states. So that shows how they could work together to reinforce the democratic values, and from there you get greater prosperity. Not meddling from China or the US and trying to undermine governments. That's what you are going to get for the next 20 years if you align.
I think
Thank you,
there's
Gerald.
oh, sorry.
Bill.
So I think, alignment doesn't necessarily meddling, right? Alignment means, can mean working together, right? So, and sorry I didn't pick up your book from 10 years ago. I was concentrating on the last 2 or 3 years that were published, under current situations. So I'm sure it's a fantastic book, Jerry, and I will run to the bookstore as soon as I get a chance. But I mean, I think the thing is, alignment, we're assuming the assumption is alignment means meddling, and alignment doesn't necessarily mean meddling. It doesn't necessarily mean capitulating to the other side. It means, developing policies that work together with the regional power, in this case, the United States or China. And so I think that's a very different thing. And so part of the definition is, and I think, there are much more benefits to be achieved by aligning, with another party in the United States, at least for certain countries within the region. I do agree, we talked about before the Central America versus, the alignment most likely is going to have to be with the US. For the Pacific Coast, I was mentioned, aligning with China may be more appropriate depending on how things work. But there is a big difference, it's hard to really relate other than economically with China, because, that's, there are no cultural ties, or, the ties are really just economic ones. Whereas, with the US, there are strong other ties that can bind the nations together and drive them to working together. But I do want to point out, by alignment, I don't mean capitulating either. I think, you can align and still have your own voice.
Okay.
Luciano.
Thank you. Okay, so on non-alignment, there was an interesting point in a couple of points that I'm picking up from the chat and also from the debate. Well, there aren't many examples of countries that have non-aligned and they have done well. China is one, but China is a very peculiar, is very unique example, partly because it's very big, partly because many economic historians argue that China has simply reverted to being a global power with a brief period in which being communist had kind of destroyed its economy. That's an argument that I am not making. It's experts on China. And so I would exclude China from the example. On other issues, well, non-alignment, alignment, and internal politics. Part of the story here is precisely the reason why the idea of trying to develop indigenous technology and intra-Latin American trade has failed is because for Latin American countries, it has been very difficult to work with each other. And European countries managed because there has been 2 world wars. We killed each other for 200 years in a row. And then at some point, the destruction was so big that we really needed American food and American technology. The Americans came, gave us the Marshall Plan and said, we're not going to give it to you unless you work with each other. And then we realized, hey, working with each other is nice. And now we have the European Union. Latin America did not get a Marshall Plan. There was no conditionality on working with each other. And even the Mercosur has worked initially, if you look at the statistics on the Mercosur, for the first 7 or 8 years, trade intra-Mercosur increases, and then it stalls. Why? Because of political misalignment between the 2 big powers, which is Argentina and Brazil. Think about this. During the Cold War, you had right-wing military dictatorships in Chile, Brazil, and Argentina, right? And they all hated each other. They had missiles pointed at each other. They were ready for war, even if they were all anti-communist and they were all right-wing, horrible dictatorships that oppress people. So I find it unrealistic to imagine that Latin American countries all of a sudden will change the course of history and start working with each other because, in theory, for us, it's good. The other problem is something that Alvaro Cuervo pointed up in the chat, which is, we are talking about grand strategy, grand geopolitical strategy. And I agree with Jerry that, you can also do nothing. You don't necessarily have to explicitly align with someone. But the point is that internal domestic politics in Latin America remains very conflictual and ideological. In many countries, there is still a quite militant left and a quite hardcore right wing. Okay, not everywhere, but in many countries. And when things change, alignment change. As an example, under the government of Correa, who turned anti-US, Ecuador closed the American naval base in Manta, which was used to, it had radars and AWACS planes, and it was one of the reasons why Ecuador was one of the safest countries in Latin America. Recently, because there is no more surveillance, Ecuador became a hotspot of narco trading, and it has become one of the less safe countries in Latin America. I cannot draw a direct causality, but there is a cause and effect. And that was because at some point in history, a domestic government in Ecuador changed from being aligned with the US to being aligned with Iran and China and so on. So that's an example that, you know, we can hypothesize what could be good in theory, but then you have a change of government and things can change quite dramatically. I mean, here, ideology remains a very big factor. You still have, you still have the kind of ideological battles of the Cold War. It may seem anachronistic, but in many countries, it's still very much that way. And I may conclude by saying that this is not it's not an issue of being pro-left or pro-right, but in the past 20 years, with the exception of Uruguay, the left in Latin America has shown some pretty undemocratic tendencies, as you can observe in countries like Ecuador under Correa, Bolivia under Morales, and Venezuela, where you had continuous changes in constitutions to stay in power. Well, not to mention Nicaragua, which has become almost a family-dominated country. So that's something we should also take into account. Exceptions could be Uruguay, exceptions could be Chile. I'm not sure Santiago could argue about that. Thank you.
Okay,
You know,
thank you, Luciano.
Luciano, I just want to, come on. Let's get into this. So if you're going to say, look, when you want to go on your own, you're going to get a narco state. Excuse me, Colombia and Mexico and previously even Venezuela was under the strong umbrella of the United States, and they're having the biggest problems historically with narco cartels. Okay, so I don't think you can, and if anything, South America has been, relatively speaking, pretty isolated or not so affected by the cartels. Yes, they're creeping, but you can't say, there's a causality. In fact, I would say actually the U.S. has been pretty good maybe in facilitating all that, because it clearly doesn't seem to matter to them in doing, the U.S. has had 30-40 years to try to do real economic and institutional development in Mexico. What it would prefer to do is do billions and billions of dollars, like we've shown in our research, on doing, militarizing the border and dealing with it that way. So, and that clearly hasn't worked. The other thing about this, again, I go back to all these problems in Latin America are real, but there's no reason to believe that a hegemon is necessary to solve those problems. And in fact, the only reason the only way you start to see solutions to these problems is when they're going to actually do it themselves. And in fact, I concede that there are tremendous problems of cooperation, whether it's Mercosur or UNASUR or in the region, for instance, on a number of things. But to a certain degree, it's only when they realize that someone from the outside won't solve it for themselves that they will be able to begin to do it. And in fact, when you look at Mercosur and UNASUR in when it works, there is that idea of self-governance. So I would say this, for instance, Luciano, if you really think like what is critical for South American development, one of the biggest things is infrastructure, transportation, and energy infrastructure. And that's going to come from the countries themselves. Will they need outside finance? Sure, but they don't need an alignment. Could the I would radically change the approach of the IDB. And for instance, if they're going to facilitate the development of infrastructure and how they work together with countries, and they could be a facilitator. but that doesn't mean there's a hard alignment. But they're going to have to learn to do it themselves. And what you want to have are mechanisms that get these countries to solve their problems with one another in a joint governance way. That's the future of the region.
Okay, quickly, I'm going to join two last questions. One regarding, are we potentially entering another Great Depression with the actions from the US? And it would also be nice to hear about another source of geopolitical tension in the region, migration, both the migration going into the US and the tensions it's creating there. And within the region, for example, Venezuelans moving to Colombia and other neighboring countries, or Haitians also moving to the Dominican Republic, etc. What are your views on these questions? Short answers, please.
I think part of it, I mean, I'm gonna leave the depression to somebody else because I'm not an economist, and so I don't think I can answer that one. I mean, the migration issue, I mean, part of it builds into the alignment story, right? And the cultural ties. Or, there's a reason why people are trying to migrate into the US, right? And so this demonstrates that, the ties between the countries. Now, how to handle this is a big issue, right? And it's a big issue that spanned administrations in the US. It's not just a Trump issue. Biden faced it, Obama faced it, in some ways, Obama was very, very harder on it than the first Trump was, right? And so this is, this demonstrates the ties, the non-economic ties, but also the cultural ties. Why do people in Latin America want to come to the US? And it also demonstrates the need for working together on these issues. And so I agree. These are terrible issues. It's big problems. They're wicked problems that, but they're also regional problems in this case. And so I think this ties the alignment picture together.
I just want to add very quickly, one thing we have not mentioned is that by this immigration issue, okay, it offers an opportunity to Latin America. Okay, and I'm going to focus on talent, not on this other immigration we're talking about. So if we don't align with the US, we may be able to bring talent back that is already in the US. Okay, and in fact, here in Chile, the new president of Universidad Católica mentioned exactly that, all the problems and tensions and the fact that immigrants are not well received in the US, Latin American immigrants or immigrants in general. That is a huge opportunity to bring talent back to our region. Okay, and I have heard people living there that are thinking about that right now, about going back. So that would be another reason why it offers an opportunity not aligning with the US.
Right. To pick up that point, don't forget, like when you think about the wealth and of a lot of these nations in Latin America, but as well as the people. Latin American diaspora, there's many big studies by the World Bank, for instance, on tapping into your diaspora around the world, which each Asian, by the way, the East Asian countries did very well in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. That Latin American countries have tremendous diaspora in many professions, and that would be an incredible source of additional investment and ties to the world. And that would be one of the big ways to go in terms of new technologies and investments.
Okay, great. Let's now continue the debate with the last round of closing arguments from both sides. And to start that out, I give the word to Gerald.
Okay, I'll end where I began. Again, thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss this very important topic. And what we want to do is, again, bring us back to a key point. First of all, historically, alignment with a major power doesn't necessarily get you growth, peace, and prosperity. In fact, if anything, Latin America, the history of the last 100 years has shown the opposite. And all we have to do is take Mexico as an example. They've gotten at great cost some marginal benefits that they really could have developed in multiple ways. The second thing is that Latin America has had historically great models of sort of the developmental state and export-led growth at different times, and they need to sustain that. That has historically, with some great leaders in the 50s and into the 60s, and more recently, say, even with smaller countries around Latin America. So the developmental state model and the export-led growth model is the viable model, as East Asian winners have shown, and that is something that is at times taking root in Latin America. The last point is that Latin America has tremendous amounts of resources, in not just natural resources, but also human capital. And it is a great place of untapped regional trade and investment. If anything, Latin America has shown that when it has grown, it doesn't necessarily need one particular region of the world, and it doesn't have those strong ties anyway. But what it does need is greater trade and investment collaboration between their own countries. And the early stages of the European post-war model is a good example. When you look at ASEAN agreements and APEC, those are in other models. So by bootstrapping together, they will not only have growth, but they will also be able to implement major advances in infrastructure and also build new types of institutions to help the collaboration and common governance.
Thank you, Gerald. Now we want to hear from Bill.
Okay. So like Gerald, I'll head back to some of my original comments as well. So this push towards non-alignment is fashionable. I mean, like I said, I did research on recent, I mean, I couldn't find anybody in an article that said don't align, or I mean that try to align, right? This is a fashionable advice, that Latin America will benefit from alignment or non-alignment. The big issue is, how do you pull it off? Right now, there are certain things that just makes it not a viable solution for other than possibly individual countries could do it. But one, limited cohesion in Latin America. I'll repeat the quote. At this writing, regional cooperation appears to be a pipe dream. I mean, this is I haven't heard anybody say anything that it would be great if Latin America all the countries consecrated together and did something, but we're not seeing evidence of that happening. Location is the other thing, right? Latin America is in the Americas, and it's not just economic location, but it's also culturally. So the connections are with one particular superpower, particularly in the Central American part of Latin America. And so the world operates based on regions right now, and I think this trend is increasing, right? Unfortunately, deglobalization, the phenomenon is actually becoming more of a regionalization phenomenon, reinforcing what's going on elsewhere. And so, and then there are differences between the parties that we talk about right here. China's connection with Latin America versus, US's connection. One's more of an economic trade partner, one's, a much more multidimensional partnership. And I think this leads to kind of the conclusion, particularly with the cultural interdependencies, that Latin America, the logical choice is to align with the United States. The other arguments of my esteemed colleagues on the other side, certainly well recognized. But, I think, given the limitations and given, the geopolitical situation of Latin America and taking a more of a realpolitik view towards the situation, I think, the argument being aligned with the United States makes the most sense.
Thank you, Bill. So now we want to hear from Santiago.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap up some of my comments and also go back to some of the previous discussion. So a lot of people saying that history shows that Latin American countries cannot get back together. Okay, but I don't see how aligning with one country, either China or the US, will help with that. I think it will exacerbate that problem because some countries will align with China and other countries will align with the US. So it will actually increase the problems, geopolitical problems within the region if we follow this path of aligning. Another point that I want to make is that one thing is aligning when the situation is stable and these powers that were supposed to align are not fighting with each other. Okay, so I think this is not the time to align either with the US or China. We have to take opportunity of this trade war and build the ties within the region. Okay, that offers a huge opportunity and a huge opportunity to lead within the global south. Okay, that's something we have been talking about. And the only way to start being a leader within the global south is to bring back talent, okay, which is another thing that I mentioned, and to establish connections within the region. Also, another point that I want to make is related to regionalization. Okay, so Bill was mentioning that right now. So regionalization, but I see that regionalization recommendation more of a putting back together the Latin American region more than thinking about aligning with the US or China independently. So regionalization I would say that it's even an argument not to align with other countries. And finally, just to finish, I think it's a moment that history should not dictate what we will do. Okay, and that means that we have the opportunity to get together, to start cooperating more, and to start building relationships and taking advantage of our position between the Pacific and the Atlantic. Okay, and that is my final statement.
Great, Santiago. Thank you. Now let's hear from Luciano to close the debate.
Thank you, Santiago. Well, I strongly disagree with Santiago in a sense that I think history repeats itself, and I think this period looks very much in many ways to the 1930s. The world is becoming more protectionist. Most countries are becoming more protectionist, and that would mean there's going to be probably blocks, right? Blocks of geopolitical and trade and economic alignment. I'm using the word alignment because the debate has gone around that, even though I don't actually like the word that much. And within this context, I think that for some parts of Latin America, there is no other option than aligning with the US, and I'm referring to Mesoamerica mostly. For other parts, including Chile, I agree with Santiago that maybe it's a good time to not to do anything explicit, which doesn't mean saying explicitly I'm not aligned, but countries that have already big links with both the US and China could play safe with not aligning economically. But ideologically, I think it would work only if they remain ideologically aligned with the US, which means democracy and open markets. On this, what worries me, having lived in Latin America for a long time, is that often non-alignment with the US in these countries after the Cold War has become an excuse for developing authoritarian tendencies. So I don't align with the US because it's an imperialist power, and then because the US is an imperialist power, I stay in power myself because, hey, I'm defending the country from the imperialists, right? And we can observe this in most countries of the region. So that is partly my worries that non-alignment can be taken as can lead to justify authoritarian governments. Okay, then sorry, but to do exactly the opposite of what Santiago is suggesting, and I'm glad we are good friends, so I'm sure he's not gonna get pissed off. Is if you think again in terms of history, a country that is famous for having been non-aligned is Argentina, right? I mean, the Peronists have destroyed Argentina. They inherited a first world country where millions of Germans, Italians, and Spanish went, and they turned it upside down to a country that has failed to progress and where people emigrate massively, searching for opportunities outside. I mean, Argentina is one of the very few countries that has regressed in spite of not having a war. I mean, the Peronists brought military dictatorship, they brought all sorts of bad stuff and dysfunctionality. Argentina is so dysfunctional that it's usually a footnote in economics textbooks because it cannot be explained. And that was the fruit of a government whose ideology was precisely non-alignment. And by the way, it was based on Italian fascism. So that's also another historical reality. And let's
30
take another
seconds.
example. Sorry, I need another example. The Brazilian military was also non-aligned. They built a lot of industry, but they also brought inequality to the stars, and they indebted their country for this. So that's how I conclude.
Great. So thanks to both teams for very well thought and provocative arguments. Now, I want to ask the audience to again vote, but let's first take a look again at how the first round of votes ended up. Against the motion, 70% of the votes, and for the motion received 30% of the votes before the debate. Now, I want to call all of those in the audience to again scan the QR code here or again go to slido.com, but this time use the code SMS winners and vote for the side that you think should receive the highest number you agree with. And let us know what your perspective is after this debate. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
You can use your mobile to scan the QR code, or you can go into slido.com and write SMS winners.
Oh, 50-50.
Okay, there's a tie. Let's see what the upcoming votes do to this ending result. Okay, so it's looking like 58% against the motion. Okay, 60% for the motion, 43%. Okay. So this shows that the speakers did a great job, and we really want to thank all of them for their fantastic presentations. And to all of you in the audience who joined us today, many thanks as well. We look forward to seeing you in our upcoming debates at SMS and also at the annual conference in San Francisco. But before leaving, I would like to hear, are there any remarks, any final remarks from the speakers about these results?
No, I mean, I think I just want to say, it was a pleasure. Just because we were on a side doesn't mean we necessarily believe in that side. We were all assigned one half or the other. So I think there are great arguments on both sides, and I was very, very happy to participate in this debate with Jerry, Santiago, and Luciano. So it was fun. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I also had a lot of fun. So this is a very interesting issue to continue discussing, and we'll see if we can turn it into actual research, right?
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is a very unique experience, especially it's good to have multidisciplinary topics. where we can bring in a variety of our background. And the fact also is that about this, I would say this about our community and the SMS and other management-based associations. With that vote, I worry that if we, as academics, we actually lack the confidence that locals know how to pull themselves out of low equilibrium or middle income trap, because it is possible, and that's where our biggest help can come in.
Thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed this, and I agree with Santiago. Maybe we could turn this into a point counterpoint. That would be an
That would be
interesting
cool.
idea. Right, Bill? Let's talk at AIB or some other conference.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thumbs up from me too. So.
All right. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. So we look forward to hearing more about this from all of you. And well, for the audience, have a good rest of day or night, depending on where you are. And we hope to see you in our upcoming debates and in San Francisco.
Excellent.
Good.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.